Let's bring in Wall Street Journal editor-at-large Gerard Baker. Gerard, thanks so much for joining me on the U.S. Report tonight. And I want to talk about a bunch of stuff here, but one thing we haven't spoken about tonight is the economy. Now, I was told that with all of these tariffs, we were going to have a repeat of the Smoot-Hawley disaster, another great massive recession by now. But apparently billions of dollars are flowing into the U.S. Treasury, and it seems like you've written about this. It seems like conventional wisdom here about economics might have been wrong. Tell us about it.
Yeah, James. Well, thanks for having me. Cast your mind back just a few months ago when the world's pundits, the world's economists, the serried ranks of all the experts said that you just can't impose tariffs in an economy the size of the United States without inviting absolute economic disaster. That if the president came in, imposed the kind of tariffs he was talking about, that would, put up the cost of living for Americans, which would have two effects. It would raise prices, so it would raise inflation, and it would give them less money to spend on everything. It would reduce their effective spending power. And people, very happily predicted a disaster, a stagflation. Well, we haven't seen that yet. Now, it's fair to say it's still early days, and we have seen some signs that maybe the economy, has slowed somewhat and that inflation remains stubbornly high. But what we clearly have not seen, James, is anything remotely like the kind of catastrophe that people were saying. And remember that Trump has put U.S. tariffs up, in effect, from an average of about 3% when he came into office to an average of nearly 20% right now. Of course, it's complicated. Some countries pay more, some pay less. But the average is 20%. If you had said that to people, when you did say that to economists, to experts a year ago, they would say that would produce, just as you say, James, another Great Depression like we had after the Smoot-Hawley tariff, supposedly back in the 1930s. But it hasn't happened. And I think the problem here is that economists, as ever, are quick to condemn everything that any Republican tries to do. But more importantly, they overlook, while there are doubtless costs to tariffs, they do overlook the possibility of benefits. You mentioned one of them, which is a lot more money coming into the U.S. Treasury. Others are that there is some evidence that people are investing in the United States again. So again, we just need to be very, very cautious about listening to these doom and gloom merchants who are, who after all have been wrong on so many pieces of economic conventional wisdom over the last 25 years.
Yeah, and it does seem that there's sort of an orthodoxy around this sort of idea that free trade is good in and of itself for its own state, but that seems to ignore, and I think this is the secret to the Trump sauce here. It's this idea that, well, he sees how that free trade, and he's been talking about this since the 80s. I've been listening to him since I was a little kid talking about this, actually hurts Americans. And one of the areas here that I think is very interesting is in hiring. And you had a great piece in the Wall Street Journal. Your paper reported this the other day, that tech startups are now starting to, after another change in tax laws, starting to go on a big domestic hiring blitz. This is another sort of aspect of this America First campaign, because previously I know a lot of people in the tech industry were very concerned about bringing in cheaper workers from overseas to do things, and now Americans seem to be standing to benefit. Tell us about this.
Yeah, look, I think there is, and again, you exactly as you say, James. The economic experts said that globalization was good, right? That you have free movement of goods and services, i.e., with no tariffs, with no trade restrictions. You have free movement of capital and free to move anywhere around the world. You have free movement of people, free migration, and that you couldn't break that mold. You couldn't break that fundamental, that benefit which had been so positive for the global economy of the last 30 years. Well, again, so we're seeing actually that the United States is testing that proposition very severely. We've already talked about the effect of tariffs. You're talking here about hiring, and that's partly obviously because of the clampdown on immigration. What we've seen in the last 6 months under Donald Trump is the most aggressive clampdown on immigration that we've ever seen in the United States, at least and certainly in the last 50 years. Now, again, people said, well, if you do that, that means, the wages are going to have to rise because, that's going to push up costs. That's going to be problematic for the U.S. economy. Well, actually, you know what? Maybe wages need to rise. Maybe one of the problems we've had in the United States for the last 30 years, as you have in Australia, is that companies have been free to hire people overseas at much lower rates, to make their goods overseas, even to produce some of their services overseas, to the detriment of domestic workers. Now we're seeing, with the clampdown on immigration, with the investment in business in the United States, we are starting to see actually American companies hire American workers again. Yeah, they're going to have to pay a bit more. Perhaps they are. And yes, that might make their profit margins slimmer, and that is a challenge. But yes, it's also going to raise the living standards of many, many Americans who've seen their living standards decline because of globalization for such a long period of time.
There's all this anti-Trump hysteria out there, and I wanted to talk about another paper, not your own Wall Street Journal, but rather the New York Times, and I was amazed to see this headline published by two former National Security Council staffers. It was entitled, "We used to think the military would stand up to Trump. We were wrong." Now, Gerard, I mean, it feels a little bit like they're saying the quiet part out loud here. Like, between the lines, there's almost a sense that they would wish for that the military would not only refuse Trump's orders when it comes to doing things like police crime in D.C. or Los Angeles, but also maybe go even further. There's an idea here, a sense that in this sort of class of thinkers, that only if they win is it actually democracy, and otherwise, well, all bets are off.
Yeah, correct, James. I mean, look, in a democracy, the military is answerable and only answerable to the civilian authorities. The commander-in-chief of the United States is President Donald Trump, as it was President Joe Biden. He alone is the commander of the American military forces. And the idea that, now, of course, the military, senior experienced military leaders are free to offer advice to the president. They're free to say, Mr. President, I don't think that's a good military strategy. And he's free to say, sorry, guys, I'm doing it. In the end, the authority rests with him. And yeah, exactly, you're right, James. For the New York Times or for others to say, why isn't the military standing up to Donald Trump? I mean, this is exactly the inversion of what you're supposed to be believing in when you talk about democracy and democracy being in peril. Democracy really would be in peril if we had an elected president who believed it was right to deploy the National Guard in certain circumstances, to pursue particular military courses of action. And listening to the New York Times, senior military leaders stood up and said, well, we're not going to do that. We're going to defy the president. He's not going to get away with it. That would be the end of democracy. You would have essentially an out-of-control military. So, of course, the military is under civilian control. And, of course, it's absurd to think that the military should somehow be defying the President Trump, in what he's trying to do.
Gerard, I just want to ask you one final question here before I let you go. Just quickly, you've had a great piece in the Journal also about this guy, Zohran Mamdani, and we're following him closely here. You say that he could be reflective of a new tilt leftward in the Democratic Party because all of the economic dislocation around AI is going to mean all of the sorts of college-educated knowledge workers that he represents are going to start demanding more and more from the government to maintain their lifestyle and their prestige. Just tell us quickly about how that's going in New York.
Yeah, James, the old familiar story. People tend to be left-wing when they're young. They have, busts of Karl Marx in their student rooms, and they wear Che Guevara T-shirts. And, as they grow a little older, wiser, more intelligent, they accumulate responsibilities, and more importantly, perhaps most importantly of all, they start to have to pay taxes. They move steadily to the right. Margaret Thatcher famously used to say, the facts of life are conservative, and when people discover the facts of life, they typically move in that direction. So what I was pointing out in the column was that this guy, Zohran Mamdani, the socialist, self-described socialist, Democratic candidate now for mayor of New York City, very much the favorite to win. In the primary vote a couple of months ago, in the Democratic primary, he won the vote of a lot of younger voters. Now, they are very disillusioned with the way things are in New York City. I live in New York City. It's a very expensive place, like major cities around the world. It's becoming increasingly difficult for people to afford the cost of living that New York represents. And I think what's really interesting, James, about my point about artificial intelligence and the way in which that's changing the workforce is those younger people may actually have an economic reason, as well as believing all the sort of tripe that they get when taught at university about decolonization and how evil the West is and how evil capitalism is. They actually, may no longer have a kind of a guaranteed future of economic success, which would typically move to the right, because AI is replacing the jobs. We've had some very interesting reports in the last couple of weeks, which have shown that the jobs that are most at risk and are already being replaced by artificial intelligence are many of those jobs that young graduates do: financial analysis, public relations, entry-level law work, that kind of stuff. So that's, I think we haven't really begun to explore yet the full political implications of AI, the way it changes the labor force, the way it's going to change people's expectations, and indeed the ability to realize their expectations about their economic performance.
Fascinating stuff, Gerard. We're going to have to leave it there, but I will tell you, I did not myself ever have a bust of Karl Marx up in my dorm room. Maybe a picture on the dartboard.
Nor did I, but some very famous people did.
I know. Anyway, Gerard, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much.